The United Nations General Assembly opens in New York during one of the most tumultuous times in its 69-year history. Can the institution cope with a world in this state of crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to a special edition of Inside Story. I'm James Bays at the United Nations in New York, where world leaders are gathering, and rarely has so much in the world been at stake. The group, ISIL, controls vast swathes of land in Iraq and Syria. In Gaza, a shaky truce is in place after a war that cost the lives of more than 2,000 Palestinians. And the list of trouble spots goes on, from Yemen to Ukraine to Libya and African conflicts like the Central African Republic, Mali and South Sudan. On top of that, there is the Ebola epidemic that is gripping West Africa. We're going to be discussing some of these problems and whether the UN has the resources to cope. First, though, this report from Kristen Salumi.
Conflict, an Ebola outbreak, and more refugees globally than at any time since World War II are all resulting in an unprecedented demand for the UN's humanitarian assistance. The Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has less than half of the $17 billion it's requested from member states to fund these emergencies, and that's forcing them to make some tough choices in the countries that they serve. Some of the most challenging situations include the Central African Republic, a conflict that has fallen off the radar in recent months, leaving UNICEF with just 20% of the $80 million it's asked for in aid for children. In South Sudan, where since December conflict has displaced 1.3 million people, hundreds of thousands are at risk of starvation. In West African countries dealing with the Ebola outbreak, the World Food Program is feeding 1.3 million victims. Iraq is the only country where the UN is in surplus. It asked countries for $312 million in aid. It's received nearly double that. But that's not the case in Syria, where after 3 years of war, the World Food Program is planning to reduce its food distributions due to funding shortfalls.
We're seeing a significant reduction in contribution to Syria. That is not to say the world has not been generous. But what we need is to continue that generosity, to continue the full global support for what is necessary to reach these people who today there's no end in sight politically. And so we can't forget that there are victims who continue to need our help.
Sadly, with so many crises and only so much money to go around, a high level of suffering is no guarantee of help. For wealthy nations, how much aid they're willing to donate often comes down to the geopolitical importance of an area. For Inside Story, I'm Kristen Salumi at the United Nations.
Until just a few days ago, Ambassador John Ashe was the president of the UN General Assembly. I spoke to him earlier, and he made it clear he believes the UN needs urgent reform if it's going to deal with all these crises effectively. Ambassador John Ashe, you were, until just a few days ago, the president of the General Assembly. You've now handed over your responsibilities. We are sitting at a time here with the General Assembly gathering with an unprecedented series of crises. How would you describe this moment for the world?
In one word, turbulent. We are indeed living in turbulent times. And I suppose if one does the analysis, you can always compare this with any other time. But certainly in my memory, I can't ever recall a September as active as the one we're currently in.
Because if you look at the list, you've got the situation in Syria and Iraq, with ISIL, Ukraine, we've had the conflict in Gaza that claimed so many lives, Ebola in Africa, the conflicts in Africa almost being forgotten, I think, by some world leaders. The fact you've got conflicts raging in South Sudan, Central African Republic, not going that well in Mali, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia. Is the UN prepared and ready to cope with this number of simultaneous problems?
Yes and no. I think one ought to be clear when one speaks of the UN, what is meant. The UN is always present. I mean, there are UN offices virtually all over, and you have UN personnel at virtually every hotspot on the world. And then you have the body, the General Assembly here in New York, which is where deliberations take place. And sometimes I think there's a confusion between the two.
In terms of those missions that are out there around the world and the help that the UN is giving to people, there is a real serious problem, isn't there, with money and resources for these missions. I was looking a short time ago at some of the amounts of money that the humanitarian part of the UN would like, and for example, we have the operation in Central African Republic, only 46% funded, the humanitarian work inside Syria just 34% funded, situation in Mali just 46% funded. This is a real problem, isn't it?
Indeed it is, and I don't think at any point in time in the UN history has there ever been such a demand for resources at any given point in time. And I think this comes at the tail end of the twin crises that we experienced in 2008 and 2009, the financial and economic crises. And member states themselves are recovering. Let's take the UK. They've had their difficulties with the economy there, and also trying to institute budgetary cuts across the board. And it's true elsewhere as well. So I think these crises have materialized at a very difficult economic time.
Is the UN system, which was built after the Second World War, really now the right system to deal with the modern world and so many problems?
Well, let me put it this way. If the UN was not in existence, it would have to be invented. It is true that after 68 years, we're beginning to see, it does appear as if it's coming apart at the seams. And perhaps what we need to see is greater adaptability to deal with emergent crises. Take, for instance, the situation in Iraq and Syria, ISIL. That never existed 2-3 years ago. So that's a new phenomenon that the international community has to deal with. And at the end of the day, the UN is best placed to help member states address some of these crises, if not all.
Having been in one of the big offices at the UN and seen this from the inside, can I ask you about the Security Council and how it does its work? Because one of the crises we're talking about is Ukraine. And there seems to be a problem when one of those great powers, the five that have the permanent seats on the Security Council and the important veto on the Security Council, when they're involved in a crisis, there's a big problem, isn't there?
Indeed, and I think certainly to anyone looking at this from the outside, one would get the distinct impression that the Security Council has not lived up to its mandate, which is to ensure international peace and security. And there have been repeated calls over the years for it to reform so that it better reflect, as far as its membership goes, the geopolitical realities of today's world. Some have indicated that an excellent opportunity presents itself when we look at the 70th anniversary in a little over a year from now. That could be a milestone that member states could aim for in terms of reform of all the organs of the United Nations, including and in particular the Security Council.
And do you have your own personal view about what exactly should be reformed with regard to the Security Council and how it should work?
Well, I, for one, have always held the view that reform ought to be an ongoing exercise rather than a one-shot deal. And if any organization, including this one, is to survive, it has to reform. And its membership and its policies and its mandates ought to reflect present-day realities. I, for one, and I think that is a persuasive view here at the United Nations, would argue that the current composition of the Security Council does not reflect present-day realities.
And what about the body that you headed, the General Assembly? We're about to see the big week of the General Assembly, all of the world leaders speaking. It's called the General Debate, right, but in fact they just make speeches. No one debates with anyone at all. Shouldn't we introduce some more debate into the system?
Well, the week kicks off the work of the General Assembly, which comprises of the body, which you refer to, where you have all 193 member states. But in addition to that, there are 6 standing committees, which is where the debate actually takes place. And that that commences after the high-level week and continues up until December.
Can you take us behind the scenes of last year? What is it actually like behind the scenes? What is going on when there are all these world leaders in New York at the same time?
Well, one of the, and perhaps the unique advantage of the United Nations is that it provides a forum for member states at various levels, including at the head of state and government level, to meet and discuss matters on a bilateral basis, and also, some say, to do deals. So what you see in terms of the general debate is only a small part of what goes on throughout the entire week, and in fact throughout the entire session. So I think it's an excellent forum in which a lot can be achieved.
Because normally when you have international meetings, whether they're bilateral meetings between 2 countries or summits, everything's agreed in advance. Do you think things get done here in New York sometimes just because people bump into each other?
Or arrange to bump into each other? Yes, I do believe, and that's why the United Nations plays such an important role in the global political stage.
Ambassador John Ashe, who was the president of the 68th session of the General Assembly, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Joining me to discuss all this are our panel of guests, and today we have 2 of the ambassadors of the countries of the United Nations, countries which are acutely affected by issues that are going to be discussed this week. With me is Vandi Chidi Minah, Sierra Leone's ambassador to the United Nations, and Amatlain Elizabeth Kabua, who is the Marshall Islands ambassador to the United Nations. Can I start with you, Ambassador Kabua? Can I start by asking you about the climate change part of this, which is the opening part of the week's events? Why is it so important to your country?
I think the answer is very simple and clear. The country is in need of attention because climate change affects our very survival. It's an existential issue that, once climate, is in effect, the islands will not be there anymore. So this is very important for our voice to be heard. And, this media is really important for the world leaders and the biggest emitter, the bad boys of climate change, to reconsider what they can do for our own survival.
You have a very pressing issue, but one that's been going on for a very long time and needs resolution, but it is a long process. Whereas, Ambassador, you have an issue that is absolutely immediate right now, because your people are dying right now, aren't they?
Quite right, James. The question of Ebola is something that nobody predicted. The rates of infection is something nobody expected. We have a situation right now where we need immediate support, immediate assistance. And what most of all we want the international community to give is a sense of hope to Sierra Leone. And that, we believe, is beginning to happen with the President Obama's announcement of 3,000 troops, the announcement of a mission, a Security Council resolution, and also a General Assembly resolution shows that the United Nations is fully behind the response to Ebola right now. And we are gratified by that. But we are quite conscious of the fact the longer we delay, the more people die. It's simply about saving lives right now.
One of the problems both of you face is that you have these very important issues facing your country, and yet if I look at the list of crises the world is dealing with right now, we can talk about the ISIL group in Iraq and Syria, we can talk about the situation in Ukraine, which involves one of the great powers directly involved in that conflict, Russia. We look at Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Central African Republic, Mali. There really isn't enough time to talk about all of this, is there, Ambassador?
No. But I wish that the political will be there to make the decision that needs attention to all these atrocities that are, creating havoc to people, the women, the old people, the children. So the countries really need to measure up to the leadership that the world needs.
Ambassador, how do you get the attention? The attention is on Ebola, but elsewhere in Africa, we all seem to have forgotten about the poor people of Central African Republic or South Sudan or so many other conflicts on your continent.
You're quite right, James. Not long ago, people were talking about Boko Haram and the girls, bring back our girls, and that seems to have gone off the boil. Unfortunately, with modern communication, social media, you would think that means more outlets to get the news out. But some people say it adds to the cacophony, the noise, the confusion. And obviously for countries, small countries especially, such as, my colleague's country and mine, we have to do as much as possible to focus the message, to develop our own media events, if you will, media focus and concentration to get the news out. It is difficult, but it's something we have to do because the world does not go according to how we want it to go.
One of the other problems, I guess, is the lack of resources to go around, the money for all these appeals. A huge appeal now for Ebola, but where are you going to get the money when there's not any money for all the refugees around the world and all the other pressing problems?
So true. I mean, talk about donor fatigue is real. This was mentioned a few years ago. And if you talk to the big UN organizations, it seems as if they're dealing with one crisis after another. Even if you take the NGOs like MSF, who's active on Ebola, they're now in Congo, they're now in Sierra Leone, they're in Guinea, they're in Liberia, and they too are talking about the difficulty of getting the big donors to focus on these issues. But what they say is that they have to keep trying. They just have to keep trying and not give up hope.
Because in many ways, Ambassador Kabua, your problem is that only every few years, you only get a few chances at climate change. Every few years there's a summit. You've got a summit coming up in Paris next year. How important is the next year?
It is very important because we need to see the countries that are big emitters to come out with a political outcome that can be very effective. So it will pave the way to more action. This is an urgent action that we needed for the smaller states that are really at the front of the climate change. It's our reality. There was a young girl, 6-year-old, that was, telling our president how she was so scared because in the middle of the night at 2 in the morning, the ocean inundated the island, and she had to be woken up, and she was so scared where to find higher ground. The Marshall Island does not have an higher ground to seek refuge. It's as flat as anything, just like here. And where can we go? And we don't want to leave the island. Look at, the situation, and please, the big boys, the bad boys, should I say that they should really think about, putting the right agenda and give us the attention and the assistance that we're seeking from them. Because we're not a polluter, we're not emitters, we're not an industrial country, we're just simple people living in the middle of the Pacific, very distant, isolated, and facing all these atrocities from the sea that give us life. So we really need that, and I really want to thank Al Jazeera because, the sixth meeting that was in Samoa that showcased the small island developing states, Al Jazeera was the only major media I learned because I was not there. But I want to thank you for being our voice to bring this issue to the world. That we
try and cover everything on this channel.
Ambassador, I have to thank you for it.
We talked about the big boys. One of the problems also is the UN system and the dominance of the big boys, isn't it? You worked, before you were your country's ambassador, you used to be in the UN. You used to be a very senior official in a number of important missions around the world. Do you think the system the world has right now is the best system?
I wouldn't say it's the best system, but we're trying to do better every day. The UN has a lot of flaws, but people say that if it didn't exist, we should try and invent it. As you know, the UN comes out of a long series of experimentation going back to the League of Nations, and with all the imperfections the UN has, all the imperfections and the problems you can see even with field missions, at the end of the day, the UN is a source of hope for the smaller countries because that's where we can get our voices heard. And we're glad that we have our own international house situated right in the middle of the Western world where we can, at best, use our abilities to be heard.
And you're talking about the General Assembly where you get heard, but at the Security Council, only really those countries sitting on the Council, the 15, have any say, and really the 5, the permanent members that have the veto, they're the only ones with the real power, aren't they, Ambassador?
Yes, and I think the wind of change needs to be there. And I think member states need to be more innovative and bringing the needed change that has to beat the challenge of changing times.
If I may, James, as you know, Security Council reform is one of those hardy perennials everybody keeps talking about. Sierra Leone is the chair of the African group. We have our own vision of what the Security Council should look like. We're talking to other groups, Pacific Forum, the G4, etc., to try and see what we can do to change the Security Council reform.
But you've been talking for years and years and years, and nothing ever happens. You're all diplomats. Do you think it's time you became a little bit less diplomatic about all this?
So true. We are talking in this session to move to real negotiations. That's what we said to the other groups. Africa, we are ready to start talking about the real issues to lead to real progress and real reform. It is going to take a long time. We feel that, but now the moment is coming to a head since we're moving to the 70th anniversary of the UN.
That could be a date where you could have real change, you believe?
Exactly.
Well, I hope so. It has to take change now. I mean, really, it's been a long process, too long, I think.
Before we finish our discussion, I'd just like to get a little taste from you of behind the scenes and what goes on this week that happens every year when all the world leaders are invited here to New York. They're all, if they decide to come, some like Vladimir Putin rarely come, but nearly all of them do at some point, not all every year. Tell us what it's like behind the scenes of the General Assembly.
Well, you have your delegation. Depending on how senior the delegation is, it means less sleep and more work for the ambassador on the ground, because you have to make sure that everything works and they go to the meetings they're supposed to go. You have bilaterals you're trying to engage. There's also perhaps a media engagement you're trying to arrange, and you're trying to make all this go very smoothly when you're highly pressurized. For the smaller countries, of course, they don't have less staff and less specialists to do all these things. So you find that you have to find yourself multitasking as an ambassador or a deputy ambassador. It is furious, fast and furious at the back, but in front, we try to make sure that it looks as if it's going smoothly.
But your president, like all presidents, expects to be treated like a president. It must be rather difficult in New York when you wander around this building and every other person here is a president.
Well, that's true. The more presidents you have in a building, the less perhaps a sense of pomp and majesty will happen. But at the end of the day, I think all presidents understand the key here is the message, not so much, you know, the pomp and circumstance as such.
Give me your insight to what it's like here during the Leaders' Week at the General Assembly.
Well, I associate myself with my colleague here that it is chaotic. It is, I would say, a diplomatic nightmare, especially for the smaller mission that have, you know, 1 or 2 staffers like mine. And, you know, it is really, you know, pain to kind of, you know, try to catch up sleep. We've been like living on just candy bars and everything that we can grab here and there, you know, but it is a challenge that, you know, I guess when it's, you press the goodness of a human body and the mind can really measure up to, you know, meet the challenges.
And the fact it's a little chaotic, does that mean that there's possibly the moment when your president can bump into President Obama or other senior leaders when the meeting wasn't even planned at all?
That's true. You do have this opportunity for, you know, a little bit of corridor diplomacy, as we call it, where it's unplanned, unscripted. You've already asked for a meeting and, you know, you've been put on hold, you know, with a major power, and then suddenly 2 leaders meet in a corridor and they get the message across. I've seen that happen, and it's a pleasant surprise. And you're always looking for those kind of events. And sometimes, you know, certain delegations try to accidentally arrange for that to happen. And so we hope that we'll have those encounters as well.
And I assume on climate change, you're hoping for a big encounter.
Exactly, surely. And I really think these are the better ones because, you know, it comes from the heart. And it's a human-to-human contact in an unscripted, you know, manner where you can really speak your mind. And the reality of, you know, the situation can really be taken when you look at the eye of the other person and tell them that you need help and urgent help, especially for the smaller states that are low-lying. These are opportunities that will take every opportunity to meet in our way. We're not particular as long as our voice is heard. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for giving us an insight into what happens here at the General Assembly and giving us a curtain raiser of the issues, so many issues that are going to be discussed by the world leaders in the next week here at the United Nations. Ambassador Minah from Sierra Leone and Ambassador Kabua from the Marshall Islands. And thanks to you for joining us on this special edition of Inside Story. Remember, you can always get in touch with us on Facebook at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, and we're on Twitter at AJ Inside Story. From all the team here at the United Nations, bye-bye for now.